Could you please open your Bibles to the book of John in the New Testament, the Gospel of John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then you come to the book of John, chapter 9, please. John chapter 9. Thank you for coming this morning. Thank you for making a wise decision to get up on a Sunday morning and put everything else aside and give a few hours to the Lord. Thank you for being here. It's an amazing book I have here in my hand. It's a miracle book. It never was written. It always has existed. Just like God never began, He always has been. His book always has been. Tell me any other book in the world that you could get up every week and announce 3 times a week, we're going to take this book and we're going to read a few words out of the book and then we're going to talk about that, and this many people would show up. There's not another book in the whole world you could do that with. And I thank God that we have a copy of it that He preserved for us, word for word, exactly the way He wanted it in our English language. And we're very fortunate that we live in a country where we still have it available to us. And it's still legal for us to own it and carry it and read it. And so thank God that we have the Bible. When some people give their what we call testimony, they go into what I call all the gory details of their past. And I don't guess there's anything wrong with that. The Bible does it several times. I mean, look at David. Look at all that the Bible tells us about David. Look at the woman at the well. You know, she had 5 different husbands, and then she was living with a man she wasn't even married to. The Bible tells us all those gory details. Look at the maniac of Gadara, naked, living out among the tombs there at the cemetery. Paul the Apostle, Saul of Tarsus, before he got saved, and actually murdered and tortured people. But I guess I'm just, I don't know how else to put it except to say, I guess I'm just so ashamed of my past, my sins. I just don't, I don't talk about them much. You know, some people when they give their testimony, it almost seems like they enjoy the memories of what it used to be like before they got saved. But I'll be honest with you, I don't have any fond memories of any of my sins. Not the ones that I committed before I got saved. Not the ones I committed yesterday. I don't have any. The only fond memories I have is of God's grace. The fond memories I have is God's mercy. The fond memories I have is the fact that God has forgiven me. Look at John chapter 9, and we're going to begin with verse 1. Verse 1 says, "And as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, Neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him." So Jesus and his disciples, walking down the street, they see a blind man. His disciples ask him these questions. He tells them that the reason he's blind is so that God can be glorified through this. Now look at verse 6. When he had thus spoken, he, speaking of Jesus, when Jesus, had thus spoken, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay, and said unto him, Go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is by interpretation sent. He went his way, therefore, and washed, and came seeing. Now, if you would, skip down to verse 13. They brought to the Pharisees him that aforetime was blind. And it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. So would you look at me just for a moment? Jesus and his disciples are walking down the street. They see this blind man. Jesus spits on the ground. Now, why in the world he did it that way, I have no idea. The Bible doesn't even give us a guess or anything, but for some reason, it's the way Jesus wanted to do it. He spit on the ground. He took that spittle. He rubbed some dirt in it. He made a little ball of clay out of it, and he put that clay on this blind man's eyes, and he said to the blind man, now go down to the pool and wash that off. So he did. And when he came back, he could see. But after he was healed, the Pharisees, in the Bible, there are two groups of people called the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They were the rulers of the land, kind of like we have our Senate and we have our House of Representatives. It's the rulers of our land. Theirs was the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the Pharisees sent for this blind man and called him in. And the reason we've heard a lot about this in the last few years of people having to testify before Congress. People having to appear before Congress and give testimony. Well, that's exactly what was happening here. They were calling this former blind man in. They wanted some testimony from him because they had been looking for a chance to condemn Jesus. And they couldn't find anything wrong. They checked his tax records. He had paid his taxes. They couldn't find anything he had done wrong, so they thought maybe this is our chance. Because Jesus had healed that blind man on the Sabbath, on Saturday. And they had a law back then that you couldn't do any work on Saturday. You couldn't go to work. You couldn't plow in your field. You couldn't repair the roof on your house. You couldn't even walk over a certain distance. You couldn't. Okay, are any of you willing to admit that you're old enough that you remember when it used to be similar to that here in America? You remember, I don't know why they called it this, but in Louisiana where I grew up, they called it the blue laws. They had the blue laws that you could not open a business. I remember as a very young child in a large city, Shreveport, Louisiana, 250,000 people or more, that there were two things open on Sunday. Just two, that's all. There wasn't a service station open. There wasn't a grocery store. There wasn't a restaurant. McDonald's wasn't open. There were two things open, the hospital and the police department. That were the only two things in the whole town that was open on Sunday. I remember that. And they had that kind of law that you couldn't work on a Sunday. And they thought maybe if we get this former blind man to come in and testify that it was on a Sunday that Jesus healed me, they could classify the healing of a blind man as work. Now they'd have a reason to arrest Jesus and get rid of him. So let's look again. Verse 13 said, they brought to the Pharisees him that aforetime was blind, and it was the Sabbath day when Jesus had made the clay and opened his eyes. Then again the Pharisees also asked him, the former blind man, how he had received his sight. He said unto them, he, speaking of Jesus, put clay upon mine eyes, and I washed and do see. Therefore said some of the Pharisees, this man, speaking of Jesus, not the blind man, this man Jesus is not of God, because he keepeth not the Sabbath day. Others said, how can a man that is a sinner do such miracles? And there was a division among them. Just like when our Congress meets and they have somebody come and testify, there's always one group that looks at the testimony one way and another group that looks at the testimony another way. Well, their Pharisees, their Congress, was divided over this issue. Now look at verse 24. Then again called they, the Pharisees, called the man that was blind, or the man that had been blind, and said unto him, give God the praise. We know that this man, speaking of Jesus, is a sinner. Would you look at me for a moment? It says, then again they called him in. They called him in the first time. He testified. Some of them didn't like what they heard, so they let him go. Then they called his parents in, and they asked them, they said to the parents, how did your son get healed, and when did it happen, and so forth. And they said, hey, he's an adult man, ask him. Don't ask us, ask him. He's the one that he can tell you what happened. So they called the son back in the second time to ask him again the same questions. So verse 24 says, then again called they the man that was blind, and said unto him, give God the praise. We know that this man Jesus is a sinner. He, the former blind man, answered and said, whether he be a sinner or no, I know not. One thing I know, that whereas I was blind, now I see. This former blind man said, I don't know exactly how it happened. I can't explain it all to you. I don't know all about this Jesus fella. I was just sitting on the side of the road one day, blind. I'd been blind since my birth. And all I can tell you is I used to be blind, but now I can see. You know, I wonder how many times that blind man wondered, why me? There were a lot of blind men in Jerusalem. It was a big city. You know there was more than one blind person in the town. Out of all the blind people in town, why did this particular fella get chosen? He couldn't even tell you. The only answer is, it's God's grace. It's God's mercy. You know, I don't know exactly how it happened. I don't know exactly what all happened. But it seems like yesterday I was that brand new convert. I was the new guy in the church. I was only 15 years of age. Nobody in my family had been to church one time in the last 5 years prior to when I got saved, a regular church service. We'd been to some funerals and weddings and stuff, but no regular church service in 5 years. And it seems like it was just yesterday that I was the brand new convert. I was the new kid in the youth group. There were about 25 or 30 teenagers in that church. And I was the only one that was brand new. When I got there and got saved, everybody else had been there most of their life. They all kind of grew up in the church. And I was the brand new kid in the youth group. And it seems like that was just yesterday. And you know, I don't know why Mr. Reed, my next door neighbor, invited me to go to Vacation Bible School. That was the first time I had contact with that church, was at Vacation Bible School. Paul Black lived next door to me. I don't know why they invited me instead of Paul. Doug Huber lived behind me across Mr. Sykes' pasture in the house up on the hill. I don't know why they invited me instead of Doug. Ken Lawler lived in the house in front of me across that pasture up on top of that hill. I don't know why they invited me instead of Ken Lawler. Randy Barmore lived 3 houses down on this dirt road we lived on. I don't know why they invited me. I do know why. It was God's grace. It was God's mercy. You know, I don't know exactly how I got from that brand new convert, 15 years of age, never been to church, at least for 5 years, and now 68 years of age, in the ministry 53 years. I can't tell you how it happened. I can't tell you why it happened. I can't tell you everything God did. But I do remember 4 things that happened to me when I first got saved. Number 1, I went to church. I got saved, and when I got saved, it just seemed like, hey, I'm a Christian now. And it seemed to me that Christians were supposed to go to church. That just seemed normal to me. It just seemed like that. I remember a few days after I got saved, I was standing in Mr. Jorgensen's pond. I was about waist deep out in the middle of the pond. I was fly fishing, catching brim. It was along the bank over there. And I got to humming out loud and singing, "Count your many blessings, name them one by one." And every time I caught another fish, I'd sing that song again. And after a few minutes, I found myself, a 15-year-old kid, down in Louisiana, standing in the middle of a pond all by myself, crying, tears running down my face, and thinking to myself, I'm humming a church song. I'm a Christian now. And it just seemed like I got saved on a Monday night. I didn't know they had church on Wednesday night. So I got saved at a special revival meeting on a Monday night, a youth meeting on a Monday night, and I didn't know they had church on Wednesday night, so the following Sunday morning, I rode a bus and went to church. Sunday night, my father brought me back to church and I got baptized. Monday night, they started a week-long. They had a one-night meeting the week before on Monday night when I got saved. The following Monday night, they were going to have a revival meeting, like you said, all week long, Monday through Saturday night. They were going to have a revival meeting. So I went to the revival meeting on Monday night. I'd been saved 1 week now, and that night, God called me to preach. So I went back Tuesday night and Wednesday night. And I found out Wednesday night that they had church every Wednesday night. So I went Thursday night and Friday night and Saturday night. And I went the following Sunday morning and Sunday night and the following Wednesday and the following Sunday and the following Wednesday and the following Sunday and the following Wednesday. And 3.5 years later, when I left home to go to Hyles Anderson College, I had missed 3 church services. One Friday night, I laid on the floor in my bedroom all night long in a fetal position, holding my stomach, cramping, sick all night long. And about daylight Saturday morning, I crawled on my hands and knees down to the other end of the house, reached up and shook my dad's arm and woke him up and said, "Dad, something's wrong. I've been sick all night." He jumped out of bed, jerked his pants on, reached down, picked me up in his arms, took me out and put me in the back of the station wagon. Now, you younger kids will have to look that up in a history book. But he laid me in the back of the station wagon and drove me as fast as he could to town to the emergency room. They put me in the hospital Saturday morning. They ran every test they could possibly run Saturday morning through Friday afternoon. I missed church Sunday morning. I missed church Sunday night. I was still in the hospital Wednesday night. I got out on Friday. I was back in church the following Sunday. I don't know exactly how I got from the 15-year-old brand new convert to the 68-year-old man who's been in the ministry 53 years. But I remember this: I went to church. It just seemed like what a Christian ought to do. The second thing I did was when I got saved. I told you I got saved on a Monday night. The following Sunday morning, I was going to go to church. As I started out the door to get on the bus to go to church, my parents' bedroom door was open about that far. And just out of the corner of my eye, I happened to notice the 2 Bibles that always laid on the dresser in my parents' bedroom. There was a thick brown Bible about that thick, had my mother's name on the outside of it. There was a thinner black Bible about that thick, had my dad's name on the outside of it. They laid on top of the dresser in my parents' bedroom. They had always been there my whole life. We never did anything with them, but they were there. So it just kind of clicked in my brain as I started out the door, hey, I'm a Christian. I'm going to church. I probably ought to take a Bible. So I went in there and I looked at those 2 Bibles, and I dead sure didn't want to take a woman's Bible to church. So I picked up that black Bible, had my dad's name on it, took it to church with me. I was sitting in Sunday school that morning, and the teacher said, turn to a certain place. And all the kids in the room picked up their Bibles and did this. So I picked up that Bible and I did this. I didn't know why, but everybody else was doing it, so I did it too. And the boy sitting next to me, his name was Shell Stevens. He was trying to be helpful. He said, psst, 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 hey, it's in the Old Testament. Well, I didn't know what the Old Testament was. I thought, some reason, when he said Old Testament, I thought, oh, I picked up the wrong Bible this morning. So I laid my Bible on the seat, and he looked at me like, you know what's wrong with you? But that was Sunday morning. Monday night, I told you I got called to preach. Well, now that I was a preacher, I felt like I should have my own Bible. You know, every carpenter has a hammer, every plumber has a wrench. I figured every preacher ought to have a Bible. But I never heard the term Bible bookstore. I never heard a Christian bookstore. I didn't know they existed. But I did know when you went to town, we lived way out in the country, the second store on the left was a drugstore, the old-fashioned kind with the soda fountain in the back and made the big malts and the tin cups. You remember those? And in the front of that drugstore, they had a glass counter with a cash register on it, and in that glass counter, they had some Bibles for sale. That's the only place I knew to buy a Bible. So I went to the drugstore to buy a Bible. And I walked up to the counter, and I looked at those Bibles, and I don't know why, but I looked around to make sure nobody was watching. And I said, I want to buy a Bible. And the lady behind the counter said, what kind of Bible? And I thought, oh, brother, I don't know. What do you mean, what kind of Bible? And I looked in the counter, and it said, Holy Bible. I said, I want to buy a Holy Bible. She said, no, I mean, are you a Catholic? or a Baptist. Because you see, back then in Louisiana, everybody was either a Catholic or a Baptist unless somebody had messed with them. And she said, are you a Catholic or a Baptist? And I said, I'm a Baptist. I'd been one a whole week now. I said, I'm a Baptist. She said, then you need a King James Bible. Isn't it amazing that lady at the drugstore knew more about the Bible than some preachers do? But she said, so I bought me a Bible, and I started taking it to church. It just seemed like the thing to do. And for 4 or 5 weeks, I did. Every Sunday and every Wednesday night, I took my Bible to church. And then one Sunday morning, my preacher made a statement that to me at the time seemed like one of the most amazing statements I'd ever heard. He said, when you go home today, you should read your Bible. And I thought, read your Bible? You know, to me, the Bible was like when you go to math class, you take your math book. When you go to history class, you take your history book. When you go to English class, you take your English book. When you go to church, you take your Bible. I never went home and read my math book. And he said, when you go home today, you should read your Bible. As I started out the door that morning, I had this brand new Bible in my hand that I'd been bringing to church. That's all I'd been doing with it, just bringing it to church. And I said, Brother White, you said this morning I should read my Bible. Where should I start? He took it from me, and he did like this, like they'd all been doing. And he said, Ray, right here is the book of Matthew. He said, this is the beginning of the New Testament. I remember thinking, oh, there's a New Testament too. I already knew there was an Old Testament. Now I knew there was a New Testament. And he said, you should begin right here in the book of Matthew. So I remember I took my finger and I put it in that spot in the Bible. I didn't want to lose my place. And I went out and got on the bus, and I sat down on the bus, and I rode all the way home that afternoon, holding my Bible with my finger in there because I didn't want to lose my spot. And that afternoon after lunch, I began to read the book of Matthew. I read a few chapters. Monday morning, I read a couple more chapters. I thought, man, this is interesting. I took my Bible to school with me, at public school, so I could read it some more at lunch. And then that afternoon, I read a little more, and that evening, I read a little more. And Tuesday, I did the same. Tuesday night, I finished the book of Matthew. And I remember thinking, wow, that was exciting. That was thrilling. I didn't know all those stories were in there. And I thought, I wonder what the next book says. And so in the book of Matthew, Jesus was born. He grew up. He performed some miracles. He got arrested. He was crucified. He was buried. He rose again. He went back to heaven. And I thought, man, that was exciting. So I turned to the book of Mark. In the book of Mark, Jesus was born. He began to grow up. Boy, did I get confused. I remember I called my pastor and I said, Brother White, how many times did Jesus come to the earth and get born? And he had to explain the Gospels to me. I didn't know. I don't know how I got from that 15-year-old kid to where it seemed like it was just yesterday, but I do know this. I went to church and I read this book right here. And the third thing that happened to me, and I'll be honest with you, I can't explain to you how this one happened. I can't explain to you why it happened. But number 3, I fell in love with preaching. Man, I just couldn't get enough of it. Sunday morning, I loved to hear my preacher preach. So I went back Sunday night, and I loved to hear him preach on Sunday night. And I went back on Wednesday night. But after just a few weeks, I figured out I want to hear more preaching than just Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. So I found out down in the deep south, there was somebody having a revival meeting or a youth rally or a Bible conference or some kind of a meeting almost every night. And so every time I could find one within driving distance, I went to hear somebody preach. I heard Jim Vineyard. I heard Wally Beebe. I heard Tom Malone. I heard B.R. Lakin. I heard Billy Kelly. I heard Harold Seitler. I heard John R. Rice. I heard Jack Hiles. I heard Tom Malone. I just couldn't get enough of the preaching. And then I figured out, well, I like it so much, I don't want to just wait until somebody has a church service. Now, you're going to admit your age here if you know what I'm talking about, but do you remember the old cassette tapes? Anybody old enough to remember those? No, I know none of you kids do. But they had these cassette tapes, and they had sermons on these cassette tapes. And you could order them and get them. And I remember the very first one, somebody loaned it to me. That's the way I found out about it. I had one of those cassette tape recorders. You remember the ones that was about the size of a loaf of bread? It took 8 big C batteries to make the thing work. And I put it on the seat in the car beside me. I had a 1965 Chevy, Ford that I drove, a Ford Fairlane. And before Detroit ever came up with the idea of there being tape players in a car, I had my tape player in my car next to me. And I remember the first sermon I heard was Pearl of Great Price. One of Brother Howell's famous sermons. I remember pulling off the side of the road because I was weeping so hard as I listened to that sermon, Pearl of Great Price. And then there was Fresh Oil. And then there was the sermon called Others. And then the one, 7 Sure Steps to Success. And then God, the God of a Second Chance. And then the sermon, this, and on and on and on. Look, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I don't know how I got from that 15-year-old kid to this 68-year-old man. But I went to church. I read this book. And I fell in love with preaching. Now, I don't know if I wanted to hear a lot of preaching because I loved it, or if I loved preaching because I listened to a lot of it. I don't know which one it was, but one or the other. And then the fourth thing is this. I just wanted to get other people saved. I told you I got saved on a Monday night at a special meeting. And I know I've told part of this story here before, but for those who didn't hear it, when I got saved that night, Mr. Reed brought me home from the service. My next door neighbor, he pulled up in front of our house and he said, "Ray, do you want me to come in the house and tell your parents what happened tonight?" I said, "No, Mr. Reed, I think I can tell them." And I intended to walk across the front yard, but the first thing I knew, I was running across the front yard. And I intended to open the door and walk in the house, but the first thing I knew, I had slammed the door back against the wall, and I had leaped across the living room and fell on my knees in front of my mother sitting on the couch, and I put my head in her lap and wrapped my arms around her waist, and I began to cry uncontrollably. And I said, "Mom, have you ever been, I got saved tonight. Have you ever been saved?" And she said, "Well, I think I have," but about a year and a half later, I was sitting in my bedroom on a Sunday afternoon, and Mom walked in. I turned around. She was crying. I thought, "Oh, brother, what have I done now?" Well, in my case, which one did she find out about? And I turned around, and Mom was crying, and then she closed the door. And you know how you boys know how you feel when Mom closes the door. Man, I knew I was in trouble. And she said, "Son, I was out doing something, and I told God, if you'll let me get home alive, I promise you I'll go straight to Ray's bedroom. I know he'll be in there on Sunday afternoon reading his Bible." And she said, "I promised God I would ask you to show me how I can know for sure I'm going to heaven." I took my Bible that my mother had bought for me for Christmas, and with my tears dripping on one page and hers dripping on the other, I took her down the Romans road. When we got off our knees, my mom knew she was going to heaven. She came to church that night and got baptized. I said the Monday night I got saved, I asked my mom if she had been saved. The next morning when I got up, I went straight in the living room. My dad had worked late the night before, and I sat down beside my dad, and many of you know, you've read the book about him. He was a paratrooper in World War II, real manly kind of a guy. My dad was kind of quiet. He never said much. If my dad thought something was hilariously funny, he would say, He just didn't say much, and I sat down beside him, and he was tying his boots up to get ready to go to work, and I said, "Dad, last night, Dad, I got saved last night. You ever been saved?" He said, "Well, of course I have." He got up and walked out. But about 3.5 years later, I was a student at Howells Anderson College, and they asked me to preach at a meeting for teenagers. And my buddy went with me and taped the sermon. I didn't even know he was doing it on one of those little tape recorders. After the sermon was over, service was over, he gave me the tape. Well, now that I had a tape ministry, I wanted everybody on my mailing list to get a copy of my tape. So I mailed that tape to my mother. She was the only one on my mailing list. And when my dad came home from work, Mom was playing that tape. He sat down, listened to it. He said, "Turn it over. I want to hear the whole thing." That night when they went to bed, Mom said my dad was crying so hard the bed was shaking. I lived in the same house with my dad 18 years. I heard him cry. I saw him cry 2 times. The day his father died, and the day my older brother and my dad got in a fist fight in the living room that night at the supper table. My mother said, "Aren't you two going to apologize to each other?" And my dad said to my brother, "Son, I'm sorry that happened." And my brother said, "Blankety blank if I'm going to apologize." That's the only 2 times I ever heard my dad cry, saw my dad cry. But Mom said he was crying so hard that night the bed was shaking. She said, "What's wrong?" He said, "I don't know." She said, "I know what's wrong. You need to get saved." He said, "That's all I've been thinking about since I heard that sermon this afternoon." Mom turned on the light, got her Bible, and showed Dad the same Romans road I had showed her. When they got off their knees, my dad knew he was going to heaven. I preached his ordination service the night he became a deacon. I said that morning, I asked my dad if he had been saved. When I came home from work that afternoon, my brother, my older brother Larry, he was underneath his 1967 Chevy Super Sport. He had a 396 engine with a 4-barrel carburetor and a 4-speed Hurst shifter on the floor. And he had it jacked up on blocks, and he was under there changing the transmission. I think he did that about once a week. And when I got off the bus and started in the house, Larry hollered, "Hey, Ray, put your books down and get under here and help me hold this transmission in place while I put the bolts back in." So I slid under the car. I'm holding it up. I hadn't been saved 24 hours yet. I'd never heard the word soul winning. I never heard anybody witness to somebody. I never heard the Romans road. But I'm laying there holding that transmission. My brother's laying beside me, and I said, "Larry, if this car fell on us right now and killed us, would you go to heaven?" He said, "Well, of course I would." I said, "You wouldn't go to heaven. You have to be saved to go to heaven." He said, "I am saved." I said, "You're not saved. You drink beer." Now, my theology was off, but not very far. But about 9 months later, no, about a year later, I was sitting in a service on a Sunday night. During the invitation, I heard footsteps coming down the aisle. You know, there's certain footsteps, you just know who it is. You don't even have to see them. I didn't even know my brother was in the service that night, but he and his fiancée were going to get married on Friday night, and they came to church Sunday night to do God a favor so he would bless their marriage. And when I heard those footsteps, I knew it was my brother. The next thing I knew, I was laying on the floor. I looked up, I was sitting on the second pew. I looked up from under the first pew. I could see the heels of my brother's cowboy boots. He was kneeling at the altar. My pastor had his arm around him. When he got off his knees, he knew he was going to heaven. Hey, I said that afternoon, I asked my brother if he was going to heaven underneath that car. I didn't know how to witness to him. I got out from under the car. I found my younger brother in the backyard. I asked Kevin. I said, "Kevin, Kevin, I got saved last night. You ever been saved?" He looked at me with the strangest look, and he said, "Well, Ray, you were there the day I got baptized." And I knew there was something different what happened to me last night than just getting baptized. But I didn't know how to explain it to him. 10 months later, I was preaching my first revival meeting. I was 15 years of age. I'd only been saved 10 months. And I was preaching my first revival meeting. And the last night of the revival meeting, during the invitation, I was kneeling over here crying because I had tried to preach and couldn't get my sermon out. And I just kept crying over and over. And I apologized and went and sat down. And the invitation, the piano just suddenly stopped playing right in the middle of a verse. They told me later my brother, who's bigger than me, had walked down the aisle. Robbie Heiner, that used to be on the Jerry Falwell Old Time Gospel Hours, the soloist, he used to play the piano and sing. He and I did meetings together. When I was a teenager and he was in college, he would play the piano and sing, and I'd preach. And that night in that meeting, my brother had walked down the aisle. He liked Robbie, and he picked Robbie. I didn't see it, but they told me he picked Robbie up off the piano bench and said, "I want to get saved." And Robbie said, "Okay, I'll show you." And behind the piano bench, Robbie Heiner won my brother to the Lord. I'm sorry, I just can't explain it. Yesterday, I was that 15-year-old kid that had just gotten saved, the newest kid in the group. Today, I'm 68 years of age. I've been married to the same beautiful lady for 46 years. It'll be 47 in just 2 weeks. August the 13th, and your anniversary is my anniversary. We have 3 beautiful daughters. They're all married to preachers. This very minute, all 7 of my grandchildren are sitting in a church service. They all know they're going to heaven. I don't know how it happened. But I remember I went to church because it just seemed like what a Christian ought to do. I read that book because my pastor told me to. Somehow I fell in love with preaching. And I just wanted everybody else I knew and loved to get saved too. You may be looking at the happiest 68-year-old man in America today. And it's all because of God's grace and God's mercy. You know, the Christian life is not real complicated. Now, it's hard to do sometimes, but it's not complicated to go to church instead of a picnic. It's not complicated to go to church instead of go to a ball game. You know, it's not complicated to open this book and read it. It's not complicated to listen to preaching and just try to obey it. And it's not complicated to tell somebody else that I got saved. I'd love that to happen to you. I'd like to have every head bowed and every eye closed.